We want to see more cooperation with Taiwan. I visited Taiwan back in December with my committee. The Chinese Communist Party were absolutely furious. But the reality is we cannot allow them to determine who we have relations
Is that a good
with.
plan then? If it's sending the Prime Minister there, wouldn't that make them even more furious?
So the
Needlessly,
Foreign
arguably.
Secretary is who I would encourage to go rather than the Prime Minister.
For the first time since 2018, a senior British minister is in China. Part of that delay is, of course, COVID, but also a cooling of relations since the so-called golden era pushed by David Cameron. The Foreign Secretary, James Cleverly, is there. He says he'll raise human rights, Ukraine and the rest. He says no significant global problem from climate change to pandemic prevention, from economic instability to nuclear proliferation can be solved without China. As he's there, the Commons Foreign Affairs Committee has released a report criticising the government's approach, saying there's a lack of coherence with its China policy. But how? The Conservative MP who chairs that committee is Alicia Kearns, who is live with us. Hello.
Morning.
Incoherent in what way?
So there is a China strategy, but it is held at the highest level of classification. So that means the vast majority of civil servants working at departments across government have no idea what it says, what its outcomes are, what its objectives are, what its limits are. But actually, even many government ministers have not seen it. So that creates enormous uncertainty, not just within government, but also for businesses, for academia, for any other industry, where they're unsure between the boundaries of caution and collaboration. Now, in contrast, the Chinese Communist Party, they know exactly what they're trying to achieve, and therefore they're able to make hay and benefit of this uncertainty.
So the incoherence then is just about who knows about it, not necessarily trying to do competing things, be that, in investment versus climate.
Well, no, they will be competing. That's the problem. Because you don't have ministers all working to the same strategy or long-term outcome we're trying to achieve on China, you will have potentially one department pushing towards something. For example, we've seen in the past investment in Confucius Institutes. We've now stopped that. We've seen previously a failure to crack down on Chinese illegal police stations. That's now been dealt with. But often this is only being dealt with because Parliament is the voice calling for these things to be actioned. So we do need an unclassified strategy that whether you're on the non-government sector or in government, you can use to help guide you on how to engage with China.
So if this is Parliament pushing this, as you have it, do you see that the Prime Minister backsliding on what he said he'd do in the leadership election when he ran in that? He called China the biggest long-term threat to Britain and the world's economic and national security. He promised to shut all those Confucius Institutes, not just not fund them anymore, as you say has happened. Is he backsliding?
So Confucius Institutes have not closed, despite my best efforts. Again, it was me that put forward an amendment that gave the government the power to shut them down if freedom of speech is being breached on them. Again, when it came to procurement bill, it was my amendment about national security and dealing with China and supply chains that has made a difference. The Home Office themselves said it was Parliament's voice that helped shut down China's illegal police stations. We need to make sure that it is government that is leading with the ideas throughout every single legislation. The energy bills coming up, I've laid amendments to make sure that we deal with weaker supply chain problems. It needs to be government leading on these issues.
But I can't understand what you think is the problem with what government's doing. Is it just that they're being passive, or that they are appeasing China, as your colleague Ian Duncan-Smith says?
So I don't believe there is any desire to appease China. I think Rishi and James Cleverly are very clear-eyed on the threat. But the reality is government is a juggernaut. The civil service is very difficult to navigate. They need to make sure there should be someone sat potentially within the Cabinet Office or within the Foreign Office who is looking at every piece of legislation coming forward from this government and looking at it from a China perspective. At the moment, the China Research Group is what is doing that. So we really need to have a more consolidated approach so that they can meaningfully protect us and build that all of society resilience.
Well, what do you make of how James Cleverly is pitching things? He was speaking to the Financial Times yesterday and has basically said that the UK is open for business, it is up for investment from China. As many companies try and de-risk around China and the supply chains, is it right for us to be welcoming, encouraging, pitching for more investment from China?
Yeah. So the big problem with that is businesses don't know where the limits are because there's no strategy. They need to be told where they cannot be. So look, the reality is we don't want to switch off all Chinese investment. That would have a significant impact on us. However, on critical national infrastructure, whether it be on certain technologies that we know are being inserted into our lives to force us to become either reliant on them or to exfiltrate our data, these should not be being permitted. And this is exactly why we need a clear strategy. Yes, we will have some Chinese investment, But absolutely, we cannot repeat the mistakes of the last 2 decades where we have opened up vulnerable bits of our economy to the Chinese Communist Party.
Are you concerned about where some of that money goes? Just reading the front page of the Financial Times this morning, they're reporting on a Goldman Sachs fund, which is using some Chinese state money to invest in various businesses in the UK. One of them includes a cybersecurity group, Netitude, which says on its website that it's an approved service provider for the UK government and helps to, quote, strengthen government and defence organisations across the world. I mean, it's just Chinese money that's going into that, but how does that sit with you?
Well, there's a real problem because we know that all Chinese companies have had to sign up to China's national security law. That means that if any part of the Chinese government asks that business for all data they hold or any information they hold, they are obliged legally to provide that to the Chinese Communist Party. And this is the problem. You know,
I don't think that's the case in this instance, though. This is just Chinese money being used in a fund that's also got private finance in it as well. But
is it a Chinese business that's registered in China?
I don't think so.
Right. Well, in which case, you know, as I said, Chinese investment, we have to allow some Chinese investment. But this is why we got the business department to create this vetting system that now exists for investment into the UK and major business.
Yeah. Just finally, on the optics of all of this, James Cleverly is in Beijing, obviously meeting his counterparts there. We know the Prime Minister is going to be meeting Xi Jinping at the G20 in a bilateral meeting. Should he also go to Taiwan?
I absolutely think he should go to Taiwan, and our report today calls for more cooperation with Taiwan, because working with Taiwan, standing by their right to self-determination and the rule of law, that is not a threat to the Chinese Communist Party. So whether it be about helping them with their international status within organizations, whether it be about trade, high-level visits or education cooperation, we want to see more cooperation with Taiwan. I visited Taiwan back in December with my committee. The Chinese Communist Party were absolutely furious. But the reality is we cannot allow them to determine who we have relations with.
Is that a good plan then? Sending the Prime Minister there, wouldn't that make them even more furious? Needlessly,
so the Foreign
arguably.
Secretary is who I would encourage to go rather than the Prime Minister. I think
so the Prime Minister shouldn't go?
To Taiwan, I don't think so. I think that would be an unnecessary escalation. But I think the Foreign Secretary would be a fitting level. The reality is that in my report today, we say that we do not accept the Chinese position on Taiwan, even though we acknowledge it.
Well, hang on. Why shouldn't the Prime Minister go to Taiwan if the Foreign Secretary could? So I don't want to get lost in the weeds in this. But if you think we should engage with them, the Prime Minister could go.
Yeah. Because it's about appropriateness. So when you look within diplomatic engagements, every single time there is a very complex cacophony of work that goes in to work out who should visit what and at what level. Look at the response to the Pelosi visit. There is about meaningful realities. Yeah. Do I think it is the best thing for Rishi Sunak to be spending his time doing? No, I do not. I don't think it's Prime Minister level. Do I think it's Foreign Secretary level? Because this is all about geopolitics and standing by our partners. And we have to recognise that even a visit by James Cleverly would be incredibly escalatory, because China's view is that Taiwan has no right to have any foreign policy at all. So it's about recognising where you can push the limits without going too far, but also what actually is right for a Prime Minister spending his time on.
Yeah. Thank you for your time this morning. Alicia Kearns, Conservative MP and Chair of the Foreign Affairs Select Committee.